All right, everyone, welcome back to another Java video. For this video, we're going to be solving the longest name problem. We're going to create a program that takes a known amount of names and outputs the longest name. You will know that the inputs are done when the user has inputted a string of X. So let's get started. This one, we don't know how many inputs we're going to get. This isn't really numeric based, so I think the while loop will be the best way to solve this problem. So let's get started with our code. Okay. First, let's set up our while loop. We're going to say while and have some sort of condition here. And it says, well, input's done when the user inputs string of X. So what I like to do in a scenario like this is create a Boolean based variable. We're going to call this a loop and set that to true. And we're going to put this here while loop is equal to true. As long as this condition is true, we're going to be continuously executing our while loop, okay? And then we can say that, well, if our user input is equals a string of X, we're going to exit the loop. And then that means we have to set our loop variable, which is a Boolean based variable, set false so that we can exit our while loop, right? So one thing I like to do when I do a while loop based solution is I really just set up my while loop so that I make sure that my while loop can end and I have some sort of a condition that will make that loop or my condition become false. So here we have potentially wrote an infinite loop because we don't know how many names we're going to get. So we want to do something like this. And this shows me, well, like I'm going to need to create a user input variable at some point. So just like we initialize the variable there, let's initialize that user input variable. We're going to call that a string. And we're going to just initialize like that. This is an empty variable initialization. We don't have a value yet, and we're going to grab values within our while loop, but this is perfectly fine to do so. So here, this is our variable initialization. And then we're going to have a solution here. Now, what else do we have to do? We have to now determine which is the longest name. So I need to know like the previous maximum, okay? And the name that generated that previous maximum as well, because, well, if that maximum was indeed the answer and the longest possible name, we're going to need to remember that. So to remember previous maximums, we're going to need two variables. We're going to an integer variable, which is the max length. I'm going to set that to 0. We haven't found it yet. And we're going to string call the answer, and we don't know it. So let's just leave it empty as well. Empty since we don't know the answer yet. Okay. So we're going to start off like this. And what we want to do is just continuously manipulate these two variables based on if we find a new longer name. So we're going to say user input. We don't need to write string here because we already declared it, is equal to sc.next line. And we're going to go system out dot println, enter a name, enter X to exit, semicolon there. There we go. So now we're going to need to do our maximum. We're going to say, well, if we're going to have a condition that user input that we just put. Let's do this. We're going to go into an else here. We're going to do an else if, because I don't want to calculate the length and do calculations if the user input was X. And this is going to help us loop. And if you really want, you can actually also write a break here to exit the loop at this moment. We're going to go else if. Actually, we're going to just go else, because if it's not equal to X, it's a valid name that we can have. So we can say, we can create a variable called int current length is equal to our user input. And we're going to use the length method on it to grab the size of our user input string. And we're going to say, well, if our current length that we found for our current name is greater than our previous maximum, which is called max length. Let's write that. We found a new name that has a bigger or a longer name. So we can say answer gets updated to user input, and then our max length becomes updated to our current length. Okay, and this is only going to happen if this condition is true. So at this point here, this is the end of while loop. So after our while loop's finished, when someone has typed in X, we have found the name that is long, or the longest. We can now say system.out.println answer is the longest name. Let's put space there, with a length of plus max length. So that is our solution so far. So let's test our code. We have an answer. Variable answer might not be initialized. It's right here. I think it's not liking this. So what we're going to do is set that to an empty string like that. Now it likes that. We're going to say Java video 12. All right, so we're going to use the name Marshall. We're going to name Freya. We're going to use Jasper. We're going to use Park. And we're going to go X. And Marshall ends up having the longest name, or is the longest name, with a length of 8. And that is our solution to our problem. Okay, this was a while loop that potentially is an infinite loop, and we said while loop this variable Boolean variable set to true, and while that is equal to true, we're going to continue to do this over and over again. And notice that when we typed in X, it stopped, and it's going to be case sensitive. Therefore, we're getting our input at every loop iteration. So as our code block is executed at every iteration, user input is grabbing the next name values that we're entering, like Marshall, Freya, Jasper, Park, and we could have gone on infinitely until we typed in the value X. Okay, so if it wasn't X, right? If it was X, we want to set loop to false, and we break, and we're now finished, and we get to go here. Otherwise, we are now calculating this variable for current lengths, where we use the string variables superpower of having this dot length method, so we can get the length, and if that length that we got is greater than our previous maximum, we can update our answer to become and hold that name, which ended up being Marshall. And we now also grab the integer value so that we can keep track of it, so that if we run into a longer name, we can re-update the answer and the maximum length as well. Okay, so that was that. It was more of a complex problem, but with introductions of loops like while loop and for loop, we're now able to do more complex problems. Anyways, as always, thank you for watching and stay classy.